Loma Linda, right?
That's right, for
Yeah.
about 15 years.
Yeah.
Of late is 15 years?
Well, yeah, for the last 15 years there's been.
We left just 3 months ago.
Okay. And right now they are staying for a while in Napa and.
We're in Napa, yeah,
Yeah,
for just a couple more months.
yeah. And they
Our
said-
daughter works at PUC.
Yeah. And it's said to come and visit us on this Sabbath and want to come here to church today. It's very nice that you were able to come.
Glad to be here.
Well, it's actually difficult to decide exactly what I should cover there in Daniel. Material that the lesson is dealing with. Last time we were supposed to cover chapter 2, but we didn't. And today we are supposed to deal with chapter 3. And these are both very familiar stories. But as you remember, last time I gave you a little bit of a background to Daniel and some important issues that, as Bonnie was talking about, help us hopefully to understand better really what's going on. Because sometimes we are so concentrated just on the stories that we know that we lose the impact of what they are trying to tell us. And one thing, for instance, that we didn't mention, and I have hardly ever heard mentioned as such, we often talk about Daniel and his 3 friends in Babylon, but they were not the only young people in Babylon from Judea at that time. And sometimes we think of poor Daniel and his 3 friends. They were taken as captives. But where did they eat? What kind of food did they get?
The best
Prison
food.
food?
Best food.
Bread and water? No, they were treated like royalty. And there were many of them. Notice what it says in verse 1, chapter 1. There were youths in whom there was no defect, good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom. It was not only Daniel and his 3 friends. Endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability to do what? In verse 4 in chapter 1. What was one of the criteria for selecting these young people?
To serve the king.
To serve the king. They were going to be part of the government. And usually what happened in this kind of instance was that the king trained them, and then once they had passed the exams, then he sent them to mostly to their home territories to become rulers, because they knew the culture and would be better suited to deal with the people. But just imagine also about these young people, and this helps us gives us a better perspective, for instance, when you come to chapter 3, that you see, they were treated like royalty, these young people, all of them. And so they were not, and who paid for their education?
The king.
The king. Were they badly treated?
No.
Poor Daniel and his 3 friends and all the others? Free education, free food. Think about your kids. Many of you have sent the kids to college and universities. Is it cheap? And you see, it was not only 1, 2, or 3. There was several of them who went through that. And the king paid for it all. Free education. And as I say, this gives a little bit more perspective to what then when we come to chapter 3. Another thing we also pointed out last time was the contrast between verse 1 and 2 in chapter 1. Verse 1 was basically the newspaper news of the time in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has done what? He has conquered one more nation. You see? But then comes verse 2 and tells us what? Was it the strength of Nebuchadnezzar and skills that conquered Israel at the time?
The Lord gave the
The
king.
Lord was behind it, and He gave the king and the country into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. So, not everything is like it looks on the surface. And that's what we are being told. And remember, I pointed out 3 times in chapter 1, we have a picture of this about God being behind it. Next thing was that Daniel had the favor of the commander or who was in charge of the young people, and he had the favor. Was it because of Daniel's personality or skills? Was that what made him popular with it?
Probably not.
Pardon me?
Probably not.
No.
Probably just his general,
Well, the Bible tells us in verse 9 what it was.
it was just his personality,
Yeah, it
the
played.
way he treated people.
Yeah, but it played a role, but was that the deciding factor?
God
What does
got
verse
that.
9 say?
Now God had brought Daniel into favor and
Yeah.
tender love with the
Who was doing it? It was God who granted him favor. And of course the personality helped, but it was not the personality that really won it. It was God who worked through the personality to reach him. And also, remember, they asked for special food, and as a result, they came out 10 times wiser than all the others. Was it the vegan food or vegetarian food that made him so clever?
It helped. Was God's
Yeah, it
blessing.
helped, but was that?
God's blessing.
Again, it says, God, verse 17, God gave them knowledge and intelligence.
Yes.
You see? And this is sort of the thing that we often forget when you read the book of Daniel. It is not primarily about these events, but it is about persons. And as I pointed out, in the first 6 chapters, they are basically an answer to the question that comes, that Nebuchadnezzar poses in chapter 3, and we'll hopefully reach to that later this morning, where he says, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? See, he could point out, when I was conquering that nation, those gods couldn't do anything to protect that nation. Look at your own nation, the Jews. Your God, he couldn't do anything. I even went into his temple and took the vessels, and God didn't do anything. So who do you think is going to help you? So basically the first 6 chapters are an answer to that question. What God is there? And as you remember, I gave those who were here last time kind of an overview, and among the things that I gave you was this chart here, God in the book of Daniel. And if you read carefully through the book of Daniel, you'll find that God is mentioned by name or names or titles 80 times in the book of Daniel. And very interesting is the fact that it's almost divided equally. In the first 6 chapters, he is mentioned 45 times. And he is mentioned in every single chapter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 45 times. When you come to chapter 7 to 12, God almost disappears. There's only one chapter, even though in the last part, 7 through 12, he's mentioned 35 times, but 24 of these are in chapter 9. And what is chapter 9? Anyone remember what is most of chapter 9 is all about in Daniel?
Yeah, coming of the Messiah after 490 years.
Yeah, but the largest part of the chapter 9 is what?
Daniel's
Seven
prayer
ways.
to God.
Is it Daniel's prayer?
Yes, the prayer.
Yeah, it's God, Daniel conversing with God. And there he is mentioned 24 times. And in the rest of the chapter, the other chapters, he's only mentioned then 11 times. And in 2 chapters, he is not even mentioned. And even in a crucial chapter for us Adventists, like chapter 8, God is not even mentioned. And same also in chapter 12. He's not even mentioned. At least not by name. He may be referred to as he or something like that, but not by name. And the question is why? Why that? Is that just coincidence? You see, in the first 6 chapters, you find various events showing us how God is at work. God is in control. On the surface, Nebuchadnezzar seems to be in control. But God says, I'm in control. And once God has proven himself, both to Daniel and mostly to the... Notice, did he need to prove himself to Daniel? No. Because we realize that Daniel knew God immediately, already in chapter 1. Because he knew God would answer his prayer. There was no question in his mind. So it's basically showing how God is trying to convince the Babylonians about who he is. And did he succeed? But only partially. And one of the chapters that we come to is the most unique chapter in the book of Daniel. Will be covered next Sabbath. It's chapter 4. Anyone remember what is unique about chapter 4 in Daniel?
Written by Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, it is Nebuchadnezzar. One of the greatest kings in world history. He has written about his personal experience with God, and it is part of the Bible. How long time did it take for God to bring him to that point? Unfortunately, we don't know, but he reigned for over, at least around 40 years, and this seems to be an experience that he had toward the close of his reign. So it may have taken God between 30 and 40 years to reach to him.
Along that line, my father, who taught Old Testament at Andrews, wrote an article back in the 1960s on the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar, the change of heart. It was based on chapter 4. So I thought I would just insert that.
Yeah.
That Nebuchadnezzar must have given his heart to God.
Yeah,
And that's why his prayer could be legitimately put in the Bible.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it tells us a lot about what does it tell us about God?
He wants everyone to be saved.
If someone says no to God, then he says, "Okay, I'm going someplace else."
He doesn't give up.
God does not give up, and he does not move any faster than people can follow.
Amen. No force.
No, that's right. And notice, we would say after chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar should have been convinced. Oh, but he wasn't. After chapter 2, what more evidence do you need? But God says, okay, I'll try again.
In those chapters,
Yes.
he had to admit that God, the God of Israelites, was powerful.
Yeah, that's right.
But along with all the other gods.
That's right. And gradually it comes, and it takes time. So, what lesson is in it for us today?
Same thing.
Should we give up if a person doesn't accept everything that we say today?
Keep trusting him.
But what if we tell them something tomorrow and the day after? When should we give up?
There've been many times here at our home church, where parents and family members have prayed for their children, and 40 years later, here they are at church.
Yeah.
You know, it just, there's a lot of hope, or even that there's been a lot of spouses whose husbands or wives weren't church members, and who later on in life, we have found them sitting in the pews beside them. So
Yeah.
many years went by, and
Yeah.
there they were. So
Yeah, you see, that's one conclusion that I have come to through my studies and teaching in the Old Testament, because it's very often difficult, really, to understand many things in the Old Testament. Why does God allow this and this and so on and so on? But one thing I've found, and it is this: God always begins with human beings where he finds them. He doesn't say, come up here, then I'll talk to you. He goes down there. The first thing one of the first things we read about God's interaction with human beings is in connection with the creation. Created Adam, but then when Adam fell, remember what happened? What did Adam do when he realized that God was coming?
Yeah.
He hid himself from God. And then we find God doing what? Did God know where he was?
Yes.
But he walked around and said, Adam, where are you? And you see, that's the only religion in the whole world where you find God's looking for man. All the other religions are about man looking for God. But the biblical religions tell us about God looking for man. And he began with Adam where he found him. He said, what are you doing here? And this is what you find throughout the Old Testament. God begins to work with people within the context where he finds them. And he uses their local cultures to begin with. But he never leaves him there. He brings man up gradually, but never faster than man is able to follow. And that helps to, at least in my mind, to clarify a lot of things in the Old Testament. Like, for instance, I remember I had once a discussion with, I was an external examiner when I was working in Iceland, and he said he had a very difficult time understanding why did God approve of slavery. Nowhere in the Bible do you find God condemning slavery and said, you shall not have slaves. But that was part of the culture. God begins there. And what did he do? He began to point out, remember, slaves are human beings. And did you know, if you take the Sabbath commandment, who is the Sabbath for? For
Everyone.
whom is the Sabbath? Yeah, man. And whom does he specify?
Everybody.
Yeah, and he specifies especially slaves and servants, that they can have a day off. So he gives a hint of what he would like. And when you come to the New Testament, you remember the story about Paul wrote the shortest, well, next to the shortest book in the New Testament is which book? The shortest one is Judah. Philemon. Now, what's Philemon about?
Slave food.
It's about a slave who had escaped. You know from American history what happened to a slave who ran away.
They were captured.
They were captured, and what could they expect as a result of running away? Anyone had a full right to kill that person.
Yeah.
And the same thing was way back there. And this slave, he had run away, and he had been converted. And now Paul is about to send him back. And to send him back to his home territory basically meant to send him directly into a death sentence. But Philemon, he had accepted also Christianity. And what did Paul say to him in his letter? Remember, Onesimus is what? He's your brother. In Roman culture, if you were making up your tax report, some of you know something about tax reports, and you have to list what they did. They listed first the household, then the property, houses and land, and then the animals that they owned, and then they listed the tools that they had. And among the tools were the slaves. What do you do with a broken shovel that you cannot repair? Throw it away. What do you do with a slave that's no longer useful? Throw it away. But notice what Paul says. He basically says to him, take your brother with you to church. In that culture meant, take your shovel, broken shovel with you to church. So notice, God is pointing upward. What is the idea? But but at the same time, he tells the slaves, be faithful to your owners. So he's working within the culture, but he's pointing upward toward the idea.
It's kind of similar to how we shouldn't start off when we want to reach out to somebody. We shouldn't start off by saying, you need to stop drinking and stop smoking right now.
Yeah.
That's not going to work for them.
No. We have to work, begin and gradually work upwards. That's what you find exactly here in Daniel. That's how he's working with Nebuchadnezzar. That's how he's working with the Babylonians. Gradually building them up, leading them higher up. But he begins within their culture. And he uses them. And even the images that he is using, as I pointed out last time, we're familiar with them. This is a decoration from Babylon. From the gate of Babylon. And what do you notice about this animal? What's unusual about it?
Wings.
It has wings. Have you ever seen a lion with wings? Read Daniel 7. What was the symbol of Babylon? lion with wings. They recognized it when Daniel spoke it. Another interesting thing. There's a lot of interesting things. And also the last time you got this little chart. It's kind of a summary chart of the book of Daniel, and his life. And you see here, he may have been, we don't know exactly the age of Daniel, but he was at least a teenager. So it's listed here as possibly about 15 when he came into captivity, about 17 when he interpreted the Daniel or Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And by then, as we will see, he already knew God so well that he knew God would answer his prayer. You don't need to be 70 years old in order to believe that. Daniel was a teenager at the time. Then fire furnace, we don't know exactly. It may have been a little bit later than is pointed out here, as we may see. And then when he is close to about 50 years of age, we find the second dream interpreted. That's the experience of Nebuchadnezzar. And when you especially read the upper part here about the chapters, something very interesting comes to light. Usually we think these are sequential chapters, all of them, but they are not. Those of you who have the chart, is chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, then we have chapter 7, chronologically, then chapter 8, then chapter 5, then chapter 9, then chapter 6, and then chapter 10 through 12. And the last four sections, 5 and chapter 5, 9, 6, and 10 through 12, were written when Daniel was in the 80s, in his 80s. It seems to be a little confusing, and what makes it even more confusing is something else. And if you look at another chart here that you have, let's see, yeah, about the structure of Daniel. If you read Daniel in the original language, it is written in two different languages. Some sections of Daniel are written in Hebrew, some are written in Aramaic. They are very closely related. It might be somewhat similar to, let's say, Spanish and Italian or something. Even perhaps more close, but anyway. But Hebrew was the language of, who spoke Hebrew? Whose language was that? Hebrew? Of the Jews, that's right. Aramaic at that time was a kind of like English is now. It was kind of commercial language. There was a kind of international trades and so on, words in Aramaic. But it was used in international business, and it became the language that the Jews picked up in Babylon, and then after they came from captivity, that was the language they spoke even in time of Christ, Aramaic. But what is interesting is, let me see here, you see chapter 1 is in Hebrew. Chapter 2, beginning in the verse, I think it's verse 4 or something like that. It says, it talks about that the Chaldeans, they spoke in Aramaic. From chapter 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. And then chapters 8 through 12, again in Hebrew. Some, see, this perhaps makes sense if it was chronological, that in the beginning of his lifetime or toward the end of his lifetime he wrote in Hebrew, and that at a particular time in his life he wrote in Aramaic. But when you compare it to the list that I told you about here, going back to the chart, all of this, chapter 1, beginning in Hebrew captivity, and then chapter 2, 3, 4 are in and 7 and are in Aramaic. In chapter 8, Hebrew, chapter 5, Aramaic, chapter 9, Hebrew, chapter 6, Aramaic, 10 through 12, Hebrew. Why is he confusing it by so much?
Who he's writing to, or for?
If you think about it, what are chapters 2 through 7 primarily about? Chapter 2 is about what? The various kingdoms throughout the world. How many of them were Christian? At least in that context. See, they were pagan countries. Chapter 3 is about, the fire furnace, and again is primary individuals that have to do with paganism or just the world. Chapter 4 is about Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5 is about the fall of Babylon. Chapter 6 is about the test, again about a foreign king, Darius, who put a test to Daniel. Chapter 7, again, dealing with the world powers. But when you come to chapter 8 through 12, it's basically dealing with the experience of God's people. It's a sanctuary in chapter 8. Chapter 9 is Daniel's prayer and about the coming of Messiah. 10 through 12, chapter 10 is again Daniel's experience with the interaction with the heavenly being and what God is doing in order to reach out to humanity, what He's trying to do for His people. And 11 and 12 are a combination of pagan or worldly events, but primarily from the perspective of how it is going to affect God's people. So, again, when he's dealing with the worldly nations, what about the language he uses? He uses their language. When he is dealing with God's people, he uses their language. Again, culture. You use different languages, ways of speaking to God's people from what you use when you speak to people who are not God's people. Again, the idea of culture. Daniel knew it. He was familiar with it, and he uses that methodology.
Well, to take it a step further, Christ, as you know, spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew.
Yeah.
If he had spoken Hebrew, then he would have been not reaching the people directly.
That's right, yeah. And we find this, remember when we were studying the book of Esther and Nehemiah last quarter, that as Esther was reading from the Aramaic scripture, from the Hebrew scriptures, there were some people along with him who did what? They were translating it to the people so they could understand it. So again, there are a lot of things we can learn from the book of Daniel apart from just some politics. And also, as I pointed out, sometimes we miss some of those important points that I think. Remember what the when did Daniel come into the environment of Babylon? very shortly after Babylon came to power. It was actually the father of Nebuchadnezzar who basically established the kingdom of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar made it a powerful empire. And so throughout his life, Daniel and his three friends, they lived through the rulership of Babylon. When we come to the end of the book of Daniel, what do we find there? Where is Babylon at that time? Babylon is gone. But where is Daniel? He is still alive. And you may remember last time, it's an interesting point, chapter 1, the last verse there in chapter 1 says that Daniel, he continued until what?
First year of Cyrus.
First year of Cyrus. Is there any importance in that? You may remember I pointed to a text in Isaiah,
It appears,
chapter 45.
it appears to me that Cyrus already knew God.
Well, at least he got to know him through Daniel, but what is very interesting,
Right away,
yeah,
he was ready to understand that the people wanted to go back to their home.
yeah, but it was not only them, but he did it for all the nations that had been taken captive into Babylon. He sent them back, and see what had happened was as Nebuchadnezzar conquered the various nations, he, or actually it had happened, well it happened actually more later, that and yeah, it was continued later until Nabonidus, who was the father of Belshazzar. What Nabonidus did, he took all the gods from the different parts of Babylonia and brought them to Babylon city. That made him very, very unpopular because their protection had been taken away. Nebuchadnezzar had also taken the gods and people from the neighboring nations. And then when Cyrus came, he began a policy of sending these back, because then he became very popular. People liked to get their gods back, because those gods were their protection. And the Jews were part of that. But in chapter 45 in Isaiah, Isaiah comes with a prophecy that was at least over 100 years before Daniel. And what did he say about Cyrus in chapter 45? Anyone remember what what Isaiah tells us in chapter 45 about Cyrus? 45 verse 1.
He held in the right hand.
Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, what? He is anointed. And this word anointed is just a translation of the word Messiah. So Cyrus is referred to in the Bible as God's Messiah. In the fact that, not necessarily because he believed and was a full believer in God, but he served the purpose that God meant for him. And the same thing about Nebuchadnezzar. If you read Jeremiah a couple of times in Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as God's servant, because he did what God wanted him to do with or for his people. But what significance does this have when it comes to Daniel? How long did Daniel basically, if we then take and put these texts together, Daniel lived until, or continued until the beginning of Cyrus. And Cyrus, according to prophecy, he was a representative of whom? Messiah. So Babylon was gone, but Daniel, he continued until the coming of the Messiah. Until the one who came, who God had appointed to deliver his people. And the last verse in Daniel says that God said to him, you go to your rest now. But in the end, you will rise up and get your reward. So, and if you take it in our context, according to Revelation, what does the book of Revelation refer to as the, quote, land in which we are living? I'm not just thinking about America, just in the world. What's the symbol that the Revelation uses about our time?
Babylon.
Babylon. And where are we living? We are living in Babylon. And Babylon seems to be conquering. They seem to be dominant all over. But what does Daniel say? In the end, Babylon is going to collapse. And if you are faithful, like Daniel, then what?
You succeed.
You will survive. Babylon is gone, but you will survive. So I mean, small points like that. All of this is in the Bible, and also most of it within the book itself. And this again why it's so important, as I pointed out last time, the idea of the context. And the context is not just the verse before and verse after. It can be the whole chapter, or the whole book, or even the whole Bible. Let me take another example that leads us, that has to do with somewhat what we are dealing with today in the lesson. Yeah, another thing also, sometimes it can be helpful. You say you may not have scholarly training as such, but how many of you can count? 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. I don't think we need a doctorate degree to be able to count. But did you know that see, when Daniel begins to interpret the dream for Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, he begins by pointing out what it is all about. Notice, for instance, in chapter 2, verse 28 and 29. Daniel 2, 28 and 29. What does it say?
But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. 29 also?
Yeah, 29.
As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came unto thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass thereafter, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass.
Yeah. And as we have checked in verse 28, literally it says what will take place at the end of the days. And that kind of an expression, end of the latter days, in the future, and similar phrases, if you go through the book of Daniel, you will find it is used 18 times in connection with prophecies in the future, and it never refers to us as immediate future, but it says you go to your rest. It's a long, long And it associates this end with an event that is referred to as the establishment of God's kingdom. So those individuals who would like to interpret, for instance, the time periods in Daniel as just short periods, just a few years and so on, they don't read the book. Because it's the establishment of God's kingdom, the final kingdom which is never going to be destroyed and which is going to destroy only others. Has that happened yet? See, some would say this refers to the time when Christ came. But the prophecies don't reach that far if you take them literally. Neither the 1260 days nor the 2300. They say it happened about 160 years before Christ. But then Christ hadn't even come to establish his kingdom. And this is far into the future. So even if we tend to prove the year-day principle on basis of two texts that basically has nothing to do with prophecy as such, but if you just look at the context, it indicates it has to do with a long, long period. It's not just 2,300 days, literal days, which is only about 6 years. But Daniel perceived this song, and he became sick. Do you think he would have become sick if it was only going to be delayed about 3 to 6 years until the kingdom would be established? He was sick for 3 weeks and couldn't understand what is going to go on. So if we read the context, then we get a lot of information, both directly and indirectly. Another thing also is yeah, I mean, time is flying, but let's look at a few things about how God works. You see, chapter, let's go back, go to chapter 2 a little bit. And see, it begins by Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 1 basically says, literally it says, he had dreams, in the plural. But it seems as if it may have been the same dream over and over again, whether it was the same night or over several nights, we don't know. But Nebuchadnezzar begins to be worried. One reason was that, you see, he was the servant of Nebo, the god Nebo. And Nebo was the god of revelation. And the king was seen to be the communicator of the wills of God to his people. How would you feel if someone gives you a message that you realize is an important message, and then when you go to the place where you're supposed to deliver it, you just cannot remember what that message was? How would you feel? He was a communicator of the will of God to the people, and the dreams were seen to be a message from the gods. How would you feel if just someone had sent you with a message to someone? I think you would feel somewhat like Nebuchadnezzar. He was frustrated. He had failed in his job and needed to do something about it. And he calls those special people in who were trained to deal with these kind of matters. But the problem was they were only trained in portion of it. And what was that portion?
Translating.
That was the interpretation. Was the other a trick? Here, if you see, here comes the king to call you in and say, well, I had a dream. Please tell me what I dreamt and what it means. What if we say something wrong and the king is just testing us? They didn't dare even try. because they didn't know whether the king was telling the truth or not. He could have known the whole dream, but he just wanted to test his wise men. And notice the conclusion that they come to. In verse 10, in chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Yeah, John.
The only thing they could do was tell the truth.
Yeah, but notice what how they phrase it. It's a very
The man
important read.
alive who can tell you your majesty your dream.
Read the whole verse. It says, verse 10 and 11 in chapter 2.
The astrologers replied to the king, "There is a man alive, or astrologer. This
Yeah.
is an impossible.
Yeah, and verse 11.
This is an impossible thing the king requires. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live among people."
So, what is the conclusion of the wise men?
Only God can do.
Only a God, and what kind of God? Whose presence is not with us. It's not those gods who are right here around us. It's another God. And they're basically admitting we don't have a connection with that God. And they come to the conclusion only God can do this.
But we don't know what God it is.
Yeah. And then when you come to when Daniel hears about it, and you see Nebuchadnezzar uses the technique that was used at the time. If you don't do what the king says, you can expect to be killed, be eradicated. And it frequently happened. And that happened, it was about to happen here, and Daniel and his three friends heard about it, and Daniel, notice, a teenager, goes to the king and says, "Give me a little bit of time, and I will tell you what it was all about." How did he know?
And faith in God. And what he has done before.
It tells us about the trust that he had in God. There was no question in his mind. He says, "Probably I can find it out." He says, "I will tell you what it is all about." And then he comes and tells his three friends about it. And then,
He just wanted to ask for time
yeah,
to fast, right, after that?
yeah. And then they pray to God and they go to sleep. Will you go to sleep in that circumstances, knowing that your life depended on what the outcome was? Then God revealed to him what it was all about. And what did Daniel do? He went to the king to check it out. Was it this? He
Praise God.
He began by thanking God. "God, thank you that you told me." Was there any question in his mind?
No.
He didn't say, "God, I hope you are right." He said, "Thank you that you have told me about it." And there's another phrase here that becomes important later. Notice one of the things that he says about God in verse 21. Now this God, you God, what?
Determines the world events.
Yeah.
21,
In the
Yeah,
second
21.
chapter.
It is he who does what?
changes the times and the seasons.
Changes the
Changes
times and seasons.
seasons.
Do you remember that statement someplace else in the book of Daniel? About a power that was going to attempt to change times and laws.
Little horn.
A little horn. And basically, you see, sometimes we just, okay, that power was going to change the Sabbath. There was more to it than that. Because notice here, what was what's the little horn trying to do? Is trying to take over what rightfully belongs to God and God alone. Who changes times and seasons?
God.
God. The little horn says, "I want to be like that." Have you found that someplace else in the Bible? Isaiah 14. Remember, Lucifer said, I want to be sitting where God is sitting. It's not just about the changing the Sabbath. It's about the power that comes in and wants to replace God. So can you see, we often say, well, just go to the Bible. But we don't read the Bible. Both of these texts are in the book of Daniel. You don't need to read the whole Bible to find it out. The Bible explains it. One more thing before, time is flying from us. That's important. When it comes to the statute, we know it all. It's about the head of gold, and then we have silver and bronze and the iron and clay, and then a stone. There's a lot of message in that. Which of these metal is most valuable?
Gold.
The gold. What's the least valuable?
Clay.
Yeah. But which is more valuable, gold or silver?
Gold.
Gold. Then which is more valuable, silver or bronze? Silver. Which is more valuable, bronze or iron? But then turn it around and say, which of these metals is the strongest and the weakest? Which is the strongest?
Iron.
The iron. Is the gold very strong?
No.
No. So as you go through the statue, you see it points out the quality decreases as we go through the time, but the strength
increases.
increases until in the end it's a mixture, because you also have the clay. And then comes something that is, from a human point of view, is absolutely worthless. How much worth is a stone? And what does that stone do?
Crushes everything.
Makes the statue into nothing. You see? Not a message there. And we know what those kingdoms represent. But how many of these kingdoms are identified within the book of Daniel? How do we know which kingdoms they represent? In Daniel 2, how many of the kingdoms are identified? Babylon is identified. The head of gold, that is you, O king. What's the next kingdom?
Medo-Persia.
Well, how do we know? We say we base it on the Bible. It's true, Medo-Persia is mentioned in connection with chapter 8. Medo-Persia and Greece are mentioned, but we don't know where it fits in, because Babylon is not mentioned in chapter 8. But in chapter 2, it's only Babylon that's identified. Then it says another kingdom, and another kingdom. But then there's one more kingdom that is identified in chapter 2. The stone kingdom. Those kingdoms continue until God establishes his kingdom. Has God established his kingdom yet? No. Therefore, we must still be within the statute. Okay. When it comes to chapter 7, how many of, we said the lion is Babylon, and then we have the bear is Medo-Persia, and so on. How do we know? How many of them are identified within chapter 7?
Not till chapter 8.
Absolutely none identified in chapter 7, except one. How God establishes his kingdom. Which tells us again, this reaches all the way to the end. How do we know that Medo-Persia is the number 2? If you look at chapter 5, in verse 28 in Daniel, what happens then? Medo-Persia conquers Babylon. So, and we are told in Daniel 2 that another kingdom is going to replace Babylonia. 528 tells us that kingdom is Medo-Persia. That's in chapter 5. Now we can connect it to chapter 8, because there Medo-Persia is mentioned first, and then comes Greece, as mentioned. So the Bible identifies at least 3 other kingdoms. And then in chapter 8 again, it culminates with God establishing his kingdom. The 4th kingdom is nowhere identified as such within the Bible. And this one reason why is this, and that I have to stop now, and it's this. When we interpret, dealing with prophecies, there are 2 questions that we would like to find answers to. Who is it? We want to point finger. Oh, this is the one. And this is when it's going to happen. This is what we are interested in. For the Bible prophecy, especially in Daniel, they are more interested in what and why. We want to be able to point out, like you were talking about there in the introduction, we want to be able to point out the Catholic Church, they are the little horn. Bible doesn't say it any place, but it tells us what a given power is going to do and why it wants to do it. One reason is, as we saw there about the little horn, one of the things it wants to replace God. It wants to take the place of God. That's why. And what is he going to do? Going to do everything in its power to do that. So let's be very careful not, when we speak about it, speak the truth in love, and rather dealing with the issues rather than the who. Because we might, within even our own church, we might have individuals who might be part of the little horn because of what they're doing. So it's not restricted just to, and I mean, you could point out, there's, if you have time, point out the indication within the text that indicates that it is not just limited to the power that started around 500 BC after Christ. It started much, much earlier. So, and finally, the important thing, again, when it came to the lesson was supposed to be today, was what we have in chapter 3. And again, it helps to count. There's one particular word, key word, that occurs 11 times in chapter 3. And that's the word worship. So chapter 3 has to do with worship, not loyalty. That was not the problem for the young men, to be loyal to the king. But they didn't want to give the impression that they were worshipping pagan God. And we are told that's going to be the one of the final tests that we are going through in the spiritual Babylon, that it will be tested on the issue of worship. Whom do you worship? Let's pray as way beyond time. Heavenly Father, thank you for the message that you have given us through the book of Daniel. Help us to learn for our spiritual benefit, that we might be ready to meet you when you come in the clouds of heaven. Help us to share that correctly to others, that they might be impressed and be ready when you come in the clouds of heaven. Thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Can we have quick lunch and then come back and meet here?
Pardon me?
Can we